Captain Du Young Park stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his crisp black Federation uniform one last time. The 4 golden stripes on his sleeves caught the morning light, reminding him of his 20 years of dedicated service. He had flown everything from small cargo ships to massive passenger cruisers, earning every stripe through hard work and exceptional skill. Today's assignment was special, piloting the Stellar Dawn, the newest luxury space cruiser in the Federation's fleet. The ship would carry 300 passengers from Earth to the famous resort worlds of Alpha Centauri. Du Young had memorized every detail of the ship's systems during the past week, though he knew most pilots relied on the automated controls these days. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Hae-Yun Lee, his co-pilot for this flight. "Captain, I'm already at the spaceport. The pre-flight checks are looking good." Du Young smiled. Hae-Yun was always early, always prepared. That's why he had specifically requested her for this flight. In the 5 years they had worked together, she had proven herself to be one of the most capable co-pilots he had ever known. The drive to the new Seoul spaceport took 30 minutes. Du Young watched the morning sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The massive shape of the spaceport came into view, a sprawling complex of gleaming metal and glass that served as Earth's busiest gateway to the stars. Security recognized him immediately. "Good morning, Captain Park," said the guard, checking his credentials with a quick scan. "The Stellar Dawn is at Gate 47. Your crew is already aboard." Du Young made his way through the bustling spaceport. Humans of all backgrounds mixed with various alien species, the tall, blue-skinned Arcturians with their clicking mandibles, the short, sturdy Proximans with their metallic scales, and even a few rare Syrians, their crystalline bodies catching and reflecting light in rainbow patterns. At Gate 47, the Stellar Dawn waited majestically. Its sleek silver hull stretched nearly a kilometer in length. This was no ordinary passenger ship. It was the height of luxury space travel, with tickets costing more than what most people earned in a year. Hae-Yun met him at the boarding gate. She stood straight and professional in her uniform, her short black hair neatly styled. "Captain," she said with a small bow, "all systems are green. The passenger manifest shows we're at full capacity today." "Thank you, Hae-Yun," Du Young replied. "Let's do our final checks together." They walked through the ship's main corridor, passing the economy section at the rear, the business class in the middle, and finally reaching the luxurious first-class cabin at the front. The difference between sections was striking. Economy had basic seats and small windows, while first class featured private pods with large viewing windows and personal entertainment systems. According to standard Federation protocol, pilots were assigned seats in first class during passenger rotation periods. This policy existed for practical reasons. Pilots needed to be close to the bridge in case of emergencies, and the extra comfort helped them stay fresh and alert. Du Young found his assigned seat, 3A, and was about to sit down when a tall Arcturian flight attendant approached him. Her blue skin seemed to shimmer under the cabin lights, and her mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation that most humans had learned to recognize. "Excuse me," she said, her translator converting her clicks into smooth English. "I believe there has been a mistake. Economy class is in the rear section of the ship." Du Young remained calm, though he felt his heart rate increase slightly. He had faced similar situations before, but never so blatantly. "There's no mistake," he said quietly, reaching for his identification card. "I'm Captain Du Young Park, the pilot of this vessel. This is my assigned seat." The Arcturian's compound eyes flickered, their version of blinking in surprise. You are the pilot." Her mandibles clicked faster. "I apologize, but I find that difficult to believe. Our records show that Captain Park is a highly decorated Federation pilot with 20 years of experience." "That is correct," Du Young said, his voice still steady. He held up his ID card, which displayed his credentials, achievements, and current assignment to the Stellar Dawn. By now, several passengers had noticed the exchange. Some were watching openly, while others pretended to be occupied with their entertainment screens. Hei-yun had stopped her pre-flight checks and stood nearby, her face showing barely controlled anger. The Arcturian flight attendant examined Do-young's ID card, her antennae twitching. "This appears to be in order, but—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Perhaps it would be more comfortable for everyone if you took a seat in business class. We have some very important passengers in first class today." Do-young felt a familiar weight in his chest, the same weight he had carried since his days at the Federation Academy, where he had graduated top of his class despite whispers and doubts. The same weight he felt each time he had to prove himself more capable, more professional, more everything than his peers just to be treated as equal. "My seat assignment is 3A, he said firmly. "It's standard protocol for the ship's pilot to be seated in first class during passenger rotation. If you have concerns about my qualifications or authority, you're welcome to contact Federation Command directly." A new voice joined the conversation. "Is there a problem here?" Do-young turned to see an elderly proximan watching them. The metallic scales covering his body were a deep bronze color, indicating his advanced age. He wore expensive clothes and had the bearing of someone used to authority. The flight attendant turned to the proximan. "No problem, sir. Just a seating confusion that we're sorting out." "I heard the entire exchange," the proximan said, his voice carrying the characteristic metallic resonance of his species. "This man has identified himself as the pilot. His credentials are in order. Why is there still a discussion?" The flight attendant's blue skin darkened, the Arcturian equivalent of a blush. "Sir, I was just trying to ensure everyone's comfort." "The only discomfort here," the proximan interrupted, "is being caused by your inappropriate questioning of a Federation captain." He turned to Do-young. "Captain Park, I apologize for witnessing this display of prejudice. I look forward to a safe journey under your command." The Arcturian flight attendant finally backed down, her mandibles now barely moving. "My apologies, Captain Park. Please enjoy your flight." She turned and hurried away, disappearing through the curtain that separated first class from business class. Do-young took his seat, maintaining his professional composure. Hei-yun approached him, concern visible on her face. "Captain, should I report this incident?" He shook his head slightly. "No need, Hei-yun. Let's focus on our pre-flight checks. We have 300 passengers counting on us for a safe journey to Alpha Centauri." As they went through their preparations, Do-young could still feel some passengers watching him. He ignored the stares, just as he had learned to ignore so many things over the years. His hands moved confidently over the tablet that controlled the ship's systems, running through the complex series of checks that would ensure everyone's safety. The proximan who had spoken up was now engaged in quiet conversation with other first-class passengers. Do-young caught fragments of their discussion. Words like prejudice and unacceptable drifted to his ears. He appreciated the support but kept his attention on his work. Experience had taught him that the best response to prejudice was excellence. An hour later, as the stellar dawn lifted smoothly from the spaceport and accelerated into the morning sky, Do-young allowed himself a small smile. The ship responded perfectly to his commands, its massive engines purring like a contented cat. As Earth's atmosphere faded from blue to black, he heard scattered applause from the passenger cabin. Appreciation for the smooth takeoff. Hei-yun checked their trajectory on her screens. "Course is stable, Captain. All systems performing optimally." "Thank you, Hei-yun," Do-young replied. He made a small adjustment to their angle of ascent, compensating for a minor solar wind disturbance that the automated systems hadn't yet detected. The movement was so subtle that none of the passengers would have noticed it. As the stellar dawn settled into its cruise path toward Alpha Centauri, Do-young reflected that incidents like the one with the flight attendant were becoming rarer. The Federation had made progress in the 50 years since humans had joined the galactic community. But progress was never a straight line, and sometimes it took unexpected events to push it forward. He didn't know it yet, But this flight would prove to be one of those events. The next few hours would test his skills, his courage, and his patience in ways he couldn't imagine. And by the end of it all, not a single passenger would question his right to sit in first class, or anywhere else on the ship. 4 hours into the flight, the Stellar Dawn cruised smoothly through space. Most passengers had settled into their usual flight routines. In economy class, families watched movies together on shared screens. Business class travelers worked on their tablets or napped in their reclining seats. The first-class cabin was quiet, with passengers enjoying their private entertainment pods or gazing out at the stars through the large windows. Do-young sat in his first-class seat, reviewing navigation data on his tablet. Years of experience had taught him to stay alert even during routine flights. Next to him, Hae-yun was reading a technical manual about the ship's newest systems. The first sign of trouble came as a slight flicker in the cabin lights. Most passengers didn't even notice it. But Do-young looked up immediately, his experienced eyes scanning the cabin's environmental displays. Something wasn't right. His tablet beeped softly, an alert from the ship's sensors. He opened the warning message and felt his heart skip a beat. The ship's long-range scanners had detected a massive solar flare heading their way. This wasn't in any of the space weather forecasts they had received before takeoff. "Hae-yun," he said quietly, showing her the alert. "Look at these readings." Hae-yun's eyes widened as she studied the numbers. "That's impossible." The solar forecasts were clear for this sector. "Space weather is never completely predictable," Do-young replied. He was already running calculations in his head. "We need to get to the bridge. Now." They stood up just as the first major wave hit the ship. The Stellar Dawn shuddered like a leaf in a storm. The cabin lights flickered again, longer this time. Several passengers looked around nervously. The Arcturian flight attendant, who had confronted Do-young earlier, rushed past them, heading for the bridge. Her blue skin had turned pale, almost white with fear. The translator at her throat conveyed her clicking sounds. "Emergency. All crew to stations." Do-young and Hae-yun followed her to the bridge. Inside, the alien crew was already panicking. Warning lights flashed across every control panel. The main navigation screen showed a sea of red indicators. "The solar flare is interfering with our navigation systems," one of the Arcturian crew members reported, mandibles clicking rapidly. "The automated controls aren't responding." Do-young assessed the situation quickly. The solar flare had created a massive electromagnetic storm around the ship. These storms could disable even the most advanced electronic systems. The Stellar Dawn's automated navigation, which most modern ships relied on completely, was going dark. "Switch to backup systems," ordered the Arcturian first officer, his antennae twitching nervously. "Backup systems are not responding either," reported another crew member. "The electromagnetic interference is too strong." The ship shuddered again, more violently this time. In the passenger cabins, people began to scream. The artificial gravity flickered, causing loose items to float momentarily before crashing back down. "We're flying blind," the first officer announced, his translated voice carrying an edge of panic. "Without navigation, we could drift into anything. Asteroid fields, gravity wells, radiation zones." Do-young stepped forward. His voice was calm but firm. "Not blind. We still have the manual controls." The bridge crew turned to look at him. The first officer's compound eyes flickered in surprise. "Manual controls? Nobody uses those anymore. They're only installed because of ancient Federation regulations." "I use them," Do-young said simply. "Captain Do-young Park, requesting permission to take manual control of the vessel." There was a moment of hesitation. The first officer looked at Do-young's uniform, at the credentials displayed on his tablet, then at the chaos of warning lights around them. Another violent shake of the ship made the decision for him. "Permission granted, Captain Park. The bridge is yours." Do-young sat at the manual control station, a compact setup that most modern pilots ignored. He ran his hands over the physical controls, the steering yoke, the thrust levers, the trim adjustments. These were the tools he had first learned to fly with, the ones he still practiced with regularly in simulators while other pilots focused only on automated systems. "Hey Yun, I need you on navigation. Use the emergency compass and the optical scanners. They're primitive, but they should still work through the electromagnetic storm." Hey Yun nodded and took her station. Like Du Young, she had maintained her skills with older systems, understanding that technology could fail when you needed it most. The ship rocked again. Through the main viewport, they could see the space around them lighting up with waves of energy from the solar flare. The effect was beautiful but deadly. Streams of charged particles that could fry their remaining electronics if they didn't act quickly. "We need to change course," Du Young announced. "The normal route would take us right through the worst of the storm." "Hey Yun, what's the status of the optical scanners?" "Working, Captain. I'm detecting a clear zone about 30 degrees to port." But she paused, checking her readings again. "There's a brown dwarf star in that direction. The gravity fields around it could be dangerous." Do Young nodded. He had studied brown dwarfs extensively during his academy days. These failed stars created complex gravitational patterns that could tear a ship apart if approached wrongly. But they also created zones of magnetic calm in their vicinity, zones that might protect them from the solar storm. "We'll use the brown dwarf's gravity to our advantage," he said. "Its magnetic field should shield us from the worst of the solar flare. We can slingshot around it using its gravitational pull to maintain our speed." The first officer's antennae twitched violently. "That's impossible. Even automated systems struggle with brown dwarf gravity fields. To navigate them manually is possible," Du Young finished firmly. "I wrote my thesis on manual navigation through irregular gravity fields. Trust me." Another violent shake ran through the ship. Warning klaxons began to sound throughout the vessel. They were running out of time. "Hey Yun, alert medical to prepare for possible gravity fluctuations, and get on the intercom. Tell all passengers to secure themselves in their seats immediately." As He-yun made the announcements, Du Young began to turn the massive ship. The manual controls responded smoothly to his touch. This was what he had trained for, what he had practiced countless hours to master. His hands moved steadily, making tiny adjustments to their course. The brown dwarf came into view through the main viewport, a massive ball of deep purple gas, radiating the last heat of a star that had failed to fully ignite. Around it, invisible but deadly, swirled complex patterns of gravitational force. Do Young felt these forces through the ship's controls. The yoke trembled in his hands as competing gravitational fields pulled at the vessel. He adjusted their approach angle carefully, using the dwarf's gravity to draw them into a curved trajectory that would shield them from the solar storm while maintaining their forward momentum. The bridge crew watched in amazement as Do Young guided the ship through maneuvers that their automated systems would have deemed impossible. His hands never hesitated, his adjustments always precise. He-yun called out readings from the optical scanners, helping him fine-tune their course through the invisible maze of gravitational forces. In the passenger cabins, people held tightly to their seats. Through the windows, they could see the massive form of the brown dwarf, its purple surface swirling with dark storms. The view was terrifying, but also magnificent, a sight few space travelers ever got to witness up close. The Arcturian flight attendant who had doubted Do Young earlier stood at her station, watching the main viewport with her mandibles completely still, a sign of total attention among her species. She saw how the human captain's hands moved with absolute precision, how he responded to each gravitational surge before it could upset their trajectory. As they reached the midpoint of their slingshot maneuver, the ship's remaining electronic systems began to stabilize. The brown dwarf's magnetic field was indeed protecting them from the solar storm, just as Do Young had predicted. Warning lights on the bridge started switching from red to yellow, then to green. "Automated systems are coming back online," He-yun reported, "but I recommend staying with manual control until we're clear of the gravity field." Do-young nodded, his focus unwavering. He could feel the ship wanting to slide sideways in the gravitational currents, but he compensated with small, precise adjustments. His years of experience, his dedication to mastering even the oldest piloting techniques, were paying off when they needed them most. The first officer watched the navigation displays with growing amazement. According to all standard protocols, what they were doing should have been impossible. Yet here they were, a massive luxury liner threading its way through one of space's most dangerous navigational challenges, guided by nothing more than human skill and determination. As they completed their slingshot around the brown dwarf, the ship's systems came fully back online. The solar storm raged harmlessly behind them now, its electromagnetic fury blocked by the dwarf's massive magnetic field. The emergency klaxons fell silent. In the passenger cabins, people began to relax their grips on their seats. Do-young made one final adjustment to their course, then sat back slightly. "We're clear of the strongest gravity fields," he announced. Hei-yun, verify our new heading. Hei-yun checked her instruments. "Course verified, Captain. We're back on track to Alpha Centauri, with only a 40-minute delay to our arrival time." The bridge erupted in relief clicks, chirps, and whistles as the alien crew celebrated their survival. The first officer approached Do-young's station, his antennae bent forward in a gesture of respect. "Captain Park," he said, "I have served on starships for 30 years. I have never seen piloting like that. You saved not only our lives, but also our ship and our careers." Do-young nodded acknowledgement, but kept his attention on the controls. They weren't completely safe yet, and he hadn't maintained his perfect safety record by celebrating too early. But inside, he felt a quiet satisfaction. Not because he had proved anyone wrong, but because when the moment came, he had been ready. His dedication to his craft, his insistence on mastering even outdated skills, had made the difference between disaster and survival. The Stellar Dawn's bridge remained tense even after they cleared the brown dwarf's gravitational field. Do-young kept his hands on the manual controls, making small adjustments as needed. Space might look empty, but he knew better. Every sector had its own challenges. Invisible currents of particles, micrometeorites, and gravitational eddies that could affect a ship's path. Hei-yun worked at her station, running diagnostics on the ship's systems as they came back online. "Captain, primary navigation is responding again. All automated systems show green. Should we switch back?" Do-young shook his head. "Not yet. Let's run a full system check first. Solar flares can damage electronics in ways that don't show up immediately." The first officer stood nearby, watching them work. His antennae hadn't stopped twitching since their close call with disaster. "Our passengers will want to know what happened," he said. "They'll have questions." "I'll speak to them," Do-young replied. "But first, we need to make sure this ship is completely safe." The next 2 hours passed in careful work. Do-young and Hei-yun checked every system on the ship, from the main engines to the smallest sensor. They found several minor issues: burned-out circuits, misaligned sensors, and confused computer systems that needed to be reset. Nothing major, but any one of those problems could have become serious if left unchecked. The Arcturian crew watched and learned. They saw how Do-young approached each problem methodically, explaining his thinking as he worked. Many of them took notes. This was the kind of practical knowledge that wasn't taught in modern space academies anymore. "Captain," one young Arcturian engineer said, her mandibles moving hesitantly, "could you explain how you knew the brown dwarf's magnetic field would protect us?" Do-young looked up from the control panel he was checking. "It's basic space physics," he said. "Brown dwarfs are failed stars, but they still have powerful magnetic fields. These fields create zones of calm in the space around them. If you know how to read gravitational patterns, you can use these zones as shelter." But reading gravitational patterns manually, she clicked her mandibles in amazement. "They told us that was impossible." "Nothing is impossible," Do-young said, smiling slightly. "It just takes practice. Lots of practice." Meanwhile, In the passenger cabins, people were starting to talk about what had happened. Word spread quickly about how the human captain had taken manual control when all the automated systems failed. Passengers who had witnessed Do Young's confrontation with the flight attendant earlier now told the story with a different tone. The elderly proxyman who had defended Do Young sat in his first-class pod, talking to a group of fellow passengers. "I've been traveling space for 40 years, he said, his metallic scales gleaming as he spoke. "Never seen anything like it. When everything went dark, I thought we were finished. Then that human pilot." He shook his head in admiration. The Arcturian flight attendant who had tried to remove Do Young from first class stood at her station, listening to the conversations around her. Her blue skin had returned to its normal color, but her mandibles moved constantly, a sign of deep thought among her people. After 3 hours of careful checks, Do Young finally felt satisfied that the ship was fully functional again. He gathered the crew on the bridge for a briefing. The solar flare was unexpected, he explained, showing them the sensor data on the main screen. "Our forecasting systems missed it because it formed and accelerated much faster than normal. This is rare, but not unheard of." He brought up a diagram of their modified course. "We had to change direction to avoid the worst of the storm. The brown dwarf provided shelter, but navigating its gravity field required precise control. That's why we switched to manual operation." The crew studied the course diagram with new respect. The path Do Young had chosen threaded between zones of intense gravitational force like a needle through fabric. According to their computers, the route should have been impossible to navigate safely. "The automated systems are working again," Do Young continued, "but this incident shows why it's important to maintain manual flight skills. Technology can fail. When it does, we need to be ready." Heyun added her own observations. "We should update our training programs, include more practice with manual controls and emergency procedures. Today, we were lucky to have a captain with these skills. Next time, we might not be so fortunate." The first officer nodded in agreement. His initial skepticism about Do Young had completely vanished. "I will recommend these changes to Federation Command immediately. Perhaps we've become too dependent on automation." Do Young turned to the Arcturian flight attendant who had doubted him earlier. "Would you please make an announcement to the passengers? They deserve to know what happened, and that the danger is past." She straightened up, her mandibles clicking softly. "Captain Park, I would like to apologize first. My behavior earlier was unprofessional and prejudiced. I was wrong about you, and I am deeply sorry." Do Young accepted her apology with a nod. "We all have prejudices to overcome. What matters is recognizing them and learning from our mistakes." The flight attendant moved to the ship's communication system. Her voice, translated into multiple languages, echoed through all cabins. "Attention all passengers. As you know, we experienced a severe solar storm that affected our ship's systems. Thanks to Captain Park's exceptional piloting skills and extensive knowledge of manual navigation techniques, we safely avoided the danger. All systems are now fully operational, and we will arrive at Alpha Centauri with only a minimal delay." The announcement was met with applause from the passengers. In first class, the elderly proxyman led the cheering. Even in economy class, where passengers hadn't known about the earlier incident with the flight attendant, people clapped and smiled with relief. Do Young didn't acknowledge the applause. Instead, he focused on preparing the ship for the rest of their journey. There were still several hours of flight ahead, and his job wasn't finished until every passenger was safely on the ground. Heyun watched him work with admiration. She had seen him face discrimination before, but he never let it affect his professionalism. He simply did his job, did it excellently, and let his actions speak for themselves. The young Arcturian engineer approached Do Young again. "Captain," she said hesitantly, "would you be willing to teach some of us about manual navigation and reading gravitational fields?" Do Young looked up from his work. "Of course. Knowledge should be shared, not hoarded. We can start with the basics of gravity field patterns if you'd like." Soon, Several crew members gathered around as Do Young explained the principles of manual space navigation. He used simple diagrams and clear examples, making complex physics understandable. The crew members, both human and alien, took notes eagerly. As he taught, Do Young remembered his own teachers at the Federation Academy. They had believed in him when others doubted, encouraged him to master both old and new technologies. Now he could pass that knowledge on to others. The first officer watched the impromptu class with approval. He had already begun drafting his report to Federation Command. This incident would change things, not just training procedures, but attitudes as well. Sometimes it took a crisis to show people the truth about their prejudices. Outside the ship's windows, space continued its eternal dance. The brown dwarf that had saved them was now just a purple dot in the distance. Ahead lay their destination, Alpha Centauri, its twin suns shining like beacons of hope. Do Young knew that this flight would be remembered for a long time, not because of the crisis they had faced, but because of what it had taught everyone aboard. Skill, knowledge, and courage knew no boundaries of species or color. In the vast darkness of space, these qualities were what truly mattered. The stellar dawn approached Alpha Centauri's spaceport as the system's twin suns cast golden light across its silver hull. In the cockpit, Do Young guided the ship through its final approach, still using manual controls. After the events of their journey, no one questioned this decision. He-yun monitored the landing systems, calling out readings in a steady voice. Atmospheric interface in 3 minutes, Captain. All systems show ready. The past few hours had been busy. News of their near disaster and miraculous save had reached Alpha Centauri ahead of them. The spaceport was buzzing with activity, preparing for their arrival. Several Federation officials waited on the ground, eager to learn more about how a luxury cruise ship had survived a crisis that should have destroyed it. Do Young focused on his instruments as they entered Alpha Centauri's atmosphere. The ship's massive hull heated up from the friction, creating a beautiful light show for the passengers watching through their windows. The manual landing would be tricky. Alpha Centauri's stronger gravity and unique atmospheric conditions always made touchdowns challenging. In the passenger cabins, people sat quietly, many of them recording the historic landing on their devices. The same passengers who had witnessed the earlier discrimination incident now waited eagerly to see their remarkable captain bring them safely home. The elderly Proximan in first class had spent the last few hours writing a detailed account of everything he had witnessed. As a retired Federation judge, his words would carry special weight. He planned to submit his report directly to the Federation Council, recommending changes to pilot training programs and anti-discrimination policies. The Arcturian flight attendant stood at her post, watching Do Young's skill with new eyes. She had learned more about humanity in the past few hours than in all her previous years of service. Her own prejudices, which she had never fully acknowledged before, now seemed both foolish and shameful. Final approach beginning, Do Young announced over the intercom. His voice was calm and professional, as if this were just another routine landing rather than the end of an extraordinary journey. Please ensure all safety harnesses are secured. The massive spaceport came into view through the front windows. Its landing pads gleamed in the golden sunlight of Alpha Centauri's twin stars. Emergency vehicles stood ready, a standard procedure for any ship that had reported problems during flight. But Do Young knew they wouldn't be needed. He guided the stellar dawn down with the same precise skill he had shown during the crisis. The ship responded to his touch like a living thing, settling onto the landing pad with barely a bump. The passengers broke into spontaneous applause. As the engines powered down and the boarding ramps extended, Do Young completed his final checks. He had maintained his perfect safety record, though this flight had tested his skills like never before. He-yun smiled at him, proud to have been part of such an historic journey. The first officer entered the cockpit, his antennae bent forward in respect. "Captain Park, there are Federation officials waiting to speak with you, and—" He paused, clicking his mandibles in what humans had learned was amusement. Every passenger on the ship wants to shake your hand. Do-young nodded. Let's take care of the official business first. Hey-yun, would you help organize the passenger departures? In the main cabin, passengers gathered their belongings while talking excitedly about their experience. Many took pictures of the cockpit entrance, hoping to catch a glimpse of the captain who had saved their lives. The story was already spreading across social media networks, complete with videos of the manual navigation through the brown dwarf's gravity field. The young Arcturian engineer who had asked Do-young for teaching stood with her fellow crew members, sharing what she had learned. The captain showed us how to read gravitational patterns manually, she explained. It's not impossible. It just takes practice and understanding. We've been relying too much on computers. A group of Federation officials boarded the ship, led by Admiral Kim, the head of pilot training programs. The elderly admiral's eyes widened as he reviewed the ship's logs, seeing exactly what Do-young had accomplished. Manual navigation through a brown dwarf's gravity field, he said, shaking his head in amazement. Most modern pilots don't even know such things are possible. Captain Park, you've demonstrated why we can never allow ourselves to become completely dependent on technology. The Arcturian flight attendant stepped forward then, her blue skin darkening with emotion. Admiral, she said, I must report my own behavior at the start of this flight. I attempted to remove Captain Park from his assigned seat, Tutu. She paused, mandibles clicking in shame, due to prejudice. Admiral Kim looked at her thoughtfully. And what have you learned from this experience? That excellence knows no species or color, she replied firmly. That my prejudices could have cost lives today, if Captain Park had not been in first class, close to the bridge when the crisis began. I request a formal reprimand in my service record. Do-young spoke up. If I may, Admiral, I believe education would be more valuable than punishment. The flight attendant has already learned from her mistake. Perhaps her experience could help train others. The Admiral nodded slowly. Agreed. In fact, Captain Park, I'd like you to help us revise our entire training program. We need to reintroduce manual flight skills, and who better to teach them than the man who just proved their worth? As the officials continued their discussion, passengers began to disembark. Many stopped to thank Do-young personally. The elderly Proximan judge handed him a copy of his report to the Federation Council. This will help ensure that what happened today brings real change, he said, his metallic scales gleaming with conviction. Families from economy class came forward to shake Do-young's hand, many of them recording the moment on their devices. Children looked up at him with awe, seeing not his color, but his heroism. Parents explained to their little ones how the captain's knowledge and skill had saved everyone on board. A week later, Do-young stood before the Federation Council itself. The great chamber was packed with representatives from hundreds of worlds, all eager to hear his story. He spoke simply and clearly about what had happened, emphasizing the importance of maintaining basic skills alongside advanced technology. Space is unforgiving, he told them. It doesn't care about our prejudices or our preferences. It only cares about our abilities, our knowledge, and our willingness to use them when needed. The Council's response was swift and unanimous. New regulations were passed requiring all pilots to maintain proficiency in manual navigation. Training programs were revised to include the skills that many had dismissed as outdated. And most importantly, stricter anti-discrimination policies were implemented across all Federation services. The Stellar Dawn incident, as it came to be known, became a standard case study at the Federation Academy. Future pilots learned not only about the technical aspects of Do-young's achievement, but also about the human factors involved. The story served as a powerful reminder that prejudice had no place among the stars. Do-young received many honors in the following months, including a promotion to fleet captain. But the recognition that meant most to him came in a different form. The young Arcturian engineer he had taught on that fateful day went on to become one of the Federation's most skilled pilots, mastering both automated and manual navigation techniques. She always credited Do-young's example and teaching for her success. He-yun continued to fly with Du-young, their partnership strengthened by their shared experience. Together, they helped train a new generation of pilots who understood that true skill meant mastering both old and new technologies. The Arcturian flight attendant became an advocate for anti-discrimination training in the space services. She shared her story openly, helping others recognize and overcome their own prejudices. Her honesty and willingness to learn from her mistakes earned her respect throughout the Federation. Years later, Du-young would sometimes visit the Federation Academy to speak to new pilot trainees. He never focused on the discrimination he had faced that day. Instead, he talked about the importance of being ready for anything space might throw at you. Technology is wonderful, he would tell them, but it's not perfect. Your greatest assets are your knowledge, your skill, and your determination to keep learning. Never let anyone tell you what's impossible. Just practice, prepare, and be ready to prove them wrong. And in the Great Hall of the Federation Academy, where the portraits of legendary pilots hung, Du-young's image now held a place of honor. Under it was a simple plaque that read, "Captain Du-young Park, who proved that excellence knows no bounds." The story of the Stellar Dawn became more than just a tale of survival against the odds. It became a reminder that true worth lies not in appearance or origin, but in ability, dedication, and character. In the vast expanse of space, these were the qualities that truly mattered, and Du-young had shown that they could be found in anyone who was willing to work for them.